Welcome to the second of two videos in this session. This video is about IDM in your classroom, or how to actually implement an inquiry in your class. Our learning intentions are learning how to choose the inquiry that's best for you and your students, and learning how to modify an inquiry for your students' needs. Our success check, I can choose a potential inquiry to use in my classroom, and I can modify an inquiry. So just a quick review over that blueprint that we were looking at in video 1. The three most important components of IDM are going to be the questions, like the compelling question, the supporting questions, the tasks, like the staging the question, the formative performance tasks, and then the summative performance task, and then the sources, those featured sources that go with each question and task. So when you're trying to find an inquiry, these are the things that you're going to want to be looking for. And it doesn't have to be perfect, as I'll show you. It doesn't have to perfectly go with what you're doing in your classroom or what your students need, but it could be close to what you need, and then you can modify it. So the first topic for this video is going to be choosing your inquiry. And I'm going to go through an inquiry that I did in my classroom this year and kind of walk you guys through my process for choosing the inquiry that was best for us and modifying it for my students' needs. So again, pre-made inquiries are available for free on the C3 Teachers website. And these are the topics that I showed you in video 1 that are available on that website for you to choose from. When you get to the C3 Teachers website, again, that website is C3 Teachers. If you're not already in the inquiry section, you can click on Inquiries at the top and it'll come to this menu. When filtering, selecting the grade is useful because it gives you kind of a general idea of what age group would be appropriate for the inquiry. But again, it doesn't have to be exactly correct. And teachers from all over the country are creating inquiries and adding them to this website. So choosing a 6th grade inquiry might not go with our 6th grade content in Hanover County. The place that I go to first is always to select the topic, and then from there, I'll kind of take the grades into consideration. So my 6th grade U.S. History 1 class completed an inquiry on the Constitution, and they had an inquiry called Constitution on that C3 Teachers website. You'll see that it was intended for 11th grade, and I teach 6th grade. That's what I taught with my inquiry this year, so it's not good in terms of the grade lineup, but you'll see how I modified it and changed it to make it more appropriate for my 6th graders. When I was looking at the description of this inquiry, the things that excited me the most were examining how the Constitution structures the government and having the students understand the government that the Constitution created. So these are two basic ideas in the U.S. History 1 content that I thought my students could learn that content through this inquiry. And again, in order to get to that full inquiry to see the sources and the breakdown of the questions, you can either go to PDF or Doc when you're on that website. So on the inquiry, there were 4 supporting questions. Supporting question 1, why did the framers of the U.S. Constitution feel a new document was necessary, with a formative performance task to generate a list of concerns that prompted the writing of the Constitution? The second supporting question, how did the Constitution structure the government? And then they are creating a graphic organizer using those sources below. Supporting question 2 was, how did the framers protect slavery in the Constitution? And they are writing a paragraph using evidence that explains how that happened using those sources. And then supporting question 4, how democratic was the 1787 Constitution? Doing that performance task using those sources. The compelling question for this inquiry on the website is, did the Constitution establish a just government? So, as a sixth grade teacher, looking at this inquiry, there are parts that really work with the US 1 content, and there are parts that are important but don't work with my specific content. And that's where the kind of considering what you can pull and what you can modify really comes into practice. So, when I was looking at these supporting questions, why did framers of the US Constitution feel a new document was necessary? I felt that was an appropriate question for my content because we go over the Articles of Confederation and how they were too weak, so we had to create a new constitution. And then the second supporting question also made sense for my content. How did the Constitution structure the government? Neither of these are worded exactly right for my content, but the general idea of the question made sense for my class. These other two questions, how did framers protect slavery and how democratic was the Constitution, are important and are probably very important for that 11th, 12th grade content. But for my class, I just didn't need them for this inquiry this year. So I narrowed it down to just those first two questions. So I only used two supporting questions when I did the inquiry with my class. And when looking at the tasks, here I was looking at how appropriate the actual task would be and whether or not my students would be successful in completing that task, and also the content for the task. So I felt that generating a list of concerns was an appropriate task for my students, and creating a graphic organizer that shows the branches of government was also an appropriate task for my content and for my students' skill level. The next step for me was to start modifying the inquiry and start changing it, looking at the sources, deciding which sources I really need, how I could make the sources more appropriate academically for my students. So the goals when you're modifying an inquiry are going to be to make it more accessible for your students. So in this scenario, I was taking an 11th grade inquiry and turning it into something appropriate for sixth graders. But you could also go the other way. You could take a second grade inquiry and try to make it appropriate for 10th grade. So just when modifying it, you're trying to make it better for your students if you need to. More closely aligning it to your content. So like in this example, in this video, I realized those last two supporting questions weren't super important for my specific content, so I could get rid of them. And then maintaining the integrity and the purpose of the inquiry. Remembering that in an inquiry, the goal is for students to answer that compelling question, which should be kind of open-ended and give them a chance to use evidence to answer it. So still trying to keep to that main purpose of an inquiry, giving students a chance to explore, even if it means you're having to choose different sources for them. And then considerations when you're modifying are going to be making sure it's not too over or underwhelming for them. So in that example of taking an 11th grade one, if I had just given my sixth graders the 11th grade inquiry, that would have been incredibly overwhelming. If I had given them a first grade inquiry, it would have been underwhelming. So just being cautious of that. And then, are the questions appropriate for my students? And you'll see how I kind of modified the questions in this inquiry to make them more appropriate for my specific students. Will students still get the same experience? So again, will they get that experience of participating in an inquiry and using evidence to complete tasks, to answer questions, to answer that compelling question? And do students need all of the sources to get it? And overall, when you're modifying, just like anything you find, you're just doing what's best for your students. So the compelling question for this inquiry that I found on C3 Teachers was, did the Constitution establish a just government? I didn't feel that that was incredibly appropriate for my specific students or my specific content, so I changed the compelling question to, did we need a new constitution? And it's not exactly the same. It's not talking about a just government, and it's, I guess, not entirely compelling for the students. It's not something that they would naturally care about, but it is something that could have multiple answers and that you would need evidence to back up that answer. So changing the compelling question, I think, is the hardest part of modifying an inquiry, because you still want to keep that integrity of what makes the question compelling. And I don't think I did a fantastic job with that for this one, but hopefully I came close to it. And then when looking at the questions, I also changed the questions themselves to make them more accessible for my students. So this first supporting question, why did the framers of the US Constitution feel a new document was necessary? I changed to why did the framers of the Constitution throw away the Articles of Confederation? And in that, I used language that I use when I'm explaining the Articles of Confederation. Throw away is a phrase that I use a lot to get that visual in my sixth graders' minds. So I wanted to include the way that I speak in my question. And then also I wanted to include Articles of Confederation in the question because that's part of my content and it's an important part of that unit. So I wanted to make sure that it was in there. And then the second question, how did the Constitution structure the government? I changed to how did the Constitution create 3 branches of government? Again, they are learning about the 3 branches of government in that US History 1 content. So I wanted to include that content knowledge in the supporting question and really make them think about that when they were answering that question. The formative performance tasks I also modified a little. So for that first question on C3 teachers, they are generating a list of concerns that prompted the writing of the Constitution. And I changed that to list 3 concerns with the Articles of Confederation. And again, I added that content knowledge, that vocabulary, Articles of Confederation in the task so that it would click for my students. And then the second performance task was to create a graphic organizer that displays the branches of government. I didn't change this too much. I kind of shortened it so that it wasn't a lot of words for my students. And I also said complete this graphic organizer because I gave them the graphic organizer to fill in based on what they saw on the sources. The next step for me was looking at the sources that were provided and determining which ones I needed, if I could. I may have needed all of them, but also determining what would be the most beneficial for my students to look at. And when looking at the actual sources, deciding whether or not I could modify the sources themselves to make them more accessible for my students. So when I looked at source A, an excerpt from a letter from Alexander Hamilton, it was incredibly lengthy on that website, which I appreciate because it's for an 11th grade class. And also it really gives you the opportunity to look at the full thing and decide for yourself what your students need. So I took what was on that document on C3 teachers and I really narrowed it down and made it much, much shorter so that the students would quickly get to the point of what Alexander Hamilton was saying. I didn't feel that I needed the other 2 sources for my students to get it on this task and this question, but I did add excerpts from the Articles of Confederation so that they would be able to read that primary source document. And I also wanted them to note that it was a firm league of friendship. I wanted them to kind of learn that language and analyze it and think for themselves what that meant for the purpose of the Articles of Confederation. The second question, the 2 sources, the first one is selections from the Constitution, and it really included everything, and I knew that my students would not make it through all of that. So just like the last one, I pared it down to the point that I needed my students to get, and I still included all 3 articles, but I really pared it down for them. I did not feel like I needed that excerpt from the Federalist Papers for the purpose of my class this year. And then I added an image of the Constitution because I wanted them to focus in on the fact that it begins with "We the People" and compare Firm League of Friendship with "We the People." The summative performance task I also modified. This was the first inquiry that I did with my students this year, and I didn't really do the full experience for them just because I felt like that would be a lot. So their summative performance task did the Constitution, establish a just government, construct an argument that addresses the compelling question using specific claims and relevant evidence from historical sources, while acknowledging competing views. I felt like that was a lot for my sixth graders, especially for their first inquiry to do that. Also, this is language that was intended for an 11th grade audience. So I wanted to keep the integrity of the purpose of an inquiry. And what I did was I took my compelling question, did we need a new constitution? I had them answer in a complete sentence and then give me 2 pieces of evidence for their answer. So my goal here was to get them practicing making a claim, making an argument as an answer to that compelling question, and then using evidence to back that up. I wanted to start practicing that skill so that by the time we do another inquiry, they might be able to um, more closely reach this summative performance task. So I'm going to show you guys now my example inquiry. I was in the online school this year, so I did it online, and I wanted to give them an opportunity to collaborate with each other. Inquiries can be done independently, whole group, or small group. And for this one, I chose to do small group just to give them the practice of collaborating and working together. And I gave them a slide deck to work on as a group. So all group members would be working within this one document together in a breakout room. So let's go to it. And so on this first page, I have my compelling question, did we need a new constitution? And I'm having them write their names. This was just a strategy that I used for almost all of my assignments this year, is having this click to add text as their cue that they need to write their answer. So you'll see that throughout the example inquiry. And then on this second page, I wanted them to feel responsible for doing something and being a part of the group. So I gave them each roles and had them sign up for that role. I did this inquiry over the course of 2 days. So they did the first supporting question on day 1, and then they did the second supporting question on day 2, and they also did that formative or summative performance task on day 2. So I told them to choose their roles, and if they hated the role on day 1, they could discuss with their group and choose different roles for day 2. And then for staging the question, in the inquiry on C3 teachers, the staging the question is to read the preamble, but I wanted something that would hook my students. So I gave them kind of a scenario to discuss and then answer questions about as a group. This next slide has that first supporting question that they were going to answer on day 1. Why did the framers of the Constitution throw away the Articles of Confederation? And then slides 5, 6, and 7 have the sources that they're using to gather evidence to answer this question. So we have that Articles of Confederation that I added as a new source. And the way that I got them to interact with the sources was by giving them questions to discuss as a group and to answer as a group. This was my way of kind of forcing that collaboration and forcing that discussion in the online world. And then source B is that Hamilton letter that I modified down and pared down so that they would really get it. And then I added one about Shays Rebellion that I didn't use for all of my classes, but I did use for some of my higher achieving classes. And then here we have this performance task. For that first question, list 3 concerns or problems with the Articles of Confederation. Hopefully they would find their concerns in the Alexander Hamilton letter, in the Articles itself, and for some of my classes in that Shays Mob source. And then I have this stop sign for them to come check in with me. And that was, since this was my first attempt at an inquiry with this group, I wanted to kind of gauge how long it would take. So it was kind of a selfish check-in so that they would come to me and I would know kind of how long it had taken them and gauge for planning and for deciding what to do moving forward. And then for most of them, I said, okay, you got to the first stop sign, you're done with this for the day. And then on the second day, they would come back to the same document and move on to the second supporting question. How did the Constitution create the three branches of government? And then they're using our sources on slides 11 through 14, that image of the Constitution where they're looking at the first three words, the Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 to get the gist of those branches of power, and then using those sources to complete the graphic organizer, which is the task for question 2. They come to the stop sign, check in with me, and then can move on to that final performance task. I didn't choose to do any extensions or taking informed action with this inquiry, but you could certainly either add it to the slide deck or create another activity to do that on. On this module, I am including a link to kind of a blank template for you if in moving forward you would like to do an inquiry in your classroom and want it to be structured similarly or play with an already created template, this is here for you. I just kind of erased where I put my compelling question and wrote compelling question as a clue to add that as your slide. Feel free to use it, feel free to modify it, feel free to change it around, do whatever is best for you. I also just erased the sources, but kept kind of the format of these slides in case you want to play with that as well. So you are welcome to use this however you would like or not use it, whatever is best for you. But for the rest of our session, we ask that you find an inquiry if you haven't yet, and then play with figuring out how it might fit for you and your students or for you and your classroom and your content, and start digging in and modifying and figuring out what would be best for you if you were to use an inquiry in the future.